Welcome to the last video in our physiological ecology variable environments topic. In this video, we're going to go through the last learning objective here, which I mentioned in the first video. Describe the difference between adaptation and acclimation. This is a really common misconception, which is why I'm setting aside an entire video to just this concept. So, the different phenotypes of a plastic trait are not adaptations per se, because the genotype of these individuals is not changing. And so if you go back to our evolution lecture and remember the definition of an adaptation is a trait that's favored by natural selection because it has the highest fitness compared to alternative traits. And these different traits all have different genotypes, and so selection acts to increase the genotype that has the highest fitness, and that's what makes it an adaptation. The ability to be plastic is definitely an adaptation, right? That's something that individuals can pass on to their offspring. But the actual change within one individual, like in a snowshoe hare from a white coat to a brown coat, that is not an adaptation because the genes aren't changing. So when you're looking at different organisms and you want to see this variation, so let's say you go and look at snowshoe hares right about when they're starting to change coat colors, and some of the hares are still white and some of the hares are still brown, how would you know if the hares were just polymorphic, they had two different coat colors, or that coat color was variable and was changing? And so you're trying to determine if the trait you're looking at is a fixed adaptation. Individuals with one variant have a different genotype compared to individuals with other variants. So in the hare example, if it were an adaptation, we would expect that the brown hares would have certain alleles for brown coat color, and the white hares would have other alleles for the white hair color. Or you could imagine phenotypic plasticity, where individuals with one variant are in different environments than individuals with other variants. And so in this case, for the hares, the two environments are going to be winter and summer, and you would expect that the coat color will be brown in summer and white in winter. And so this conundrum is something when we don't know an organism particularly well and we go out into nature and we see all this variation, this is one of the first questions we ask is what we're looking at plasticity or is it an adaptation? And so one of the best ways to test this is actually using genetic clones, so individuals with the same genotypes, and common garden experiments. And those two things are really easy in plants. And so we're going to talk about a plant example. So here we have this plant, sticky cinquefoil. So sticky cinquefoil grows along mountainsides, and it can grow at all elevations, lowland, mid-elevation, and alpine gardens. And so researchers wanted to know if sticky cinquefoil was plastic, meaning that it didn't matter where the plant came from, you put it in the different environments and it's going to grow to the size and shape that it needs to be to survive and do well in that environment. Or if these different clones were locally adapted, meaning that if you took that clone out of the environment that it was adapted to, it wouldn't grow the same in the other environments because it had different genes that specify the way it should grow in that environment. And so the experiment here, the null hypothesis, if you're using clones, your lowland plants here, all of them have the exact same genotype. Your mid-elevation plants all have the exact same genotype, and the alpine plants all have the exact same genotype. And so if there's no genetic differences between lowland plants, mid-elevation plants, and alpine plants, you would expect this pattern, where all the plants grow the same way in each garden, okay? And the differences between the same morph, so the lowland plants in the lowland garden versus the mid-elevation garden versus the alpine garden, those differences are due to plasticity. Okay, so here are your plastic responses, and then here's your evidence that there are no genetic differences. So here are the actual results. And so when we look at this, we should ask ourselves two questions. Are there genetic differences, and is there plasticity? And so let's think back. What was our evidence for genetic differences? If there were no genetic differences, we expect all three types to grow exactly the same in each habitat. That's not what we see, right? We have the mid-elevation plants in the mid-elevation garden seem to be growing pretty tall, and the lowland and alpine plants are not as tall. The lowland is the shortest, and the alpine is somewhere in the middle. And we see this in all the different habitats. And so that suggests that there actually are genetic differences. The clones are showing different growth patterns when grown in the same environment. So that's evidence of genetic differences. But is there evidence of plasticity? So to look for evidence of plasticity, we need to look at the same clone in the three different habitats. If it were all due to genetics, we would expect them to grow the same no matter what the habitat was. But when you look at the same clone in different habitats, you see that no, there's some plasticity there too, right? Because this mid-elevation plant is a little bit shorter in the lowland garden, a little bit less leafy, and it's much shorter and much less leafy in the alpine garden. And so not only are there genetic differences, but there's also plasticity. And the reality is, in most species, you have some combination of both. So our results in this experiment did not support the null hypothesis. Differences in growth in the gardens indicated genetic differences among populations, and they also indicated plasticity. So before we go, I wanted to let you know that I'm part of a common garden experiment here on campus. So I've teamed up with Dr. Morella, also in the biology department. And this spring and summer, we planted milkweed in 2 gardens right here on campus. So this is the path that leads to the train tracks here and over to East Campus. And then if you go this way, you're heading towards our building, the science building. And so we planted 40 milkweed plants, 10 plants each from 4 different locations. And 10 of those are from Bridgewater. And then we have some from Minnesota, some from Ohio, and some from New York. And so the idea here is that by planting these different plants from the different locations in a common garden, we can see if any one of them is particularly good at growing no matter where it is, or we might find that they are really locally adapted to wherever they come from and they just don't do well elsewhere. So it's a really cool experiment, and it just started, so hopefully, I don't have data yet, but hopefully in a couple years I'll be able to add some data to this video.